Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing a Twinkling Happy Hanukkah card using this Menorah Lights die from Spellbinders. This die set also has 3 sentiments that work perfectly with the die image. And I'll also share an alternative card for using this die set throughout the year. For that alternative card, I'll also be using the Whimsical Skies 3D embossing folder as well as the Village Companions die set. To start off with, I have a piece of Hammermill Cardstock here in my Misty stamping tool. It is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, and I'm going to stamp and emboss one of the sentiments for the background. I'm going to do some ink blending on the background so that sentiment is going to show up after I've done my ink blending. I used a little bit of embossing powder tool on that cardstock, stamped the sentiment with some Versamark ink. Now this was a new stamp set, so the very first thing that I did with the stamp set was use a white eraser on the stamping surface. It just helps it to take ink a little bit better, and that only needs to be done one time before using it, and then you never have to do it again. Once I've stamped it with that Versamark ink, I use some super fine white embossing powder on it and use my heat tool to melt that powder, and then I trim that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I have a piece of silver brushed cardstock from the Silver Treasured Cardstock pack that is 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I am going to be cutting out the frame of the menorah here. Now I'm going to be cutting out the inner parts as well as the outer parts with white as well. To eliminate that step, it's easiest to just do it right now. At this point, I didn't know what I wanted the outline of my menorah to be or what color I wanted it to be. So I end up choosing white. So best to use both dyes together, just like I'm doing on this silver piece here, on that first step, so that you have both of those pieces done without adding an extra step of die cutting. At that point though, I wasn't sure, like I said, what color I wanted the outside to be and had forgotten that I was going to ink blend the background. So I have another piece of Hammermill cardstock where I am die cutting the outline part so that I have that ready to go. The last piece I need to cut is my candles, and I'm using a scrap of Celestial cardstock for that. I'm just going to die cut that, put all of those pieces to the side. Now, as I said, I'm creating a Twinkling Happy Hanukkah card, so I'm going to be using the Twinkle lights from Pear Blossom Press in order to have some of those candles light up. So I'm going to be gluing all of this onto some vellum so we have some open space that has some transparency to it to be able to see those lights. For my background, I'm going to use a couple of distress inks to ink that background. I'm using some squeezed lemonade around the candles. I want them to look like they're glowing. I'm using some weathered wood towards the menorah base, and then I'm going to use some chipped sapphire around the outside. Now you could always take a piece of like navy or blue cardstock for that background and just have a solid background. I always love the look of ink blending though, because it has some lights and darks to it and creates a little bit more visual interest to it. So I opted to do this instead of solid cardstock. I also love the look of ink blending behind candle dies or whatnot to give that like glow of the candlelight. So I have that on my sticky mat. I use some large Spellbinders brushes for that and make the ink blending super quick and easy. Now I did my heat embossing for my sentiment with white embossing powder. Silver embossing powder would also look fantastic for that, and then would show up really well once we're done that ink blending on the background. I have a piece of vellum here that I'm going to be gluing everything to. So once we have the background done, we can start to just inlay the different pieces. It's almost like fitting a puzzle together because they're all die cut from the same die and they were all taped together and not changed. Everything is going to fit in perfectly. So I'm going to use some Barely Art glue. I'm trying to use little bits around that background simply because, or the back of the die cut, because vellum doesn't really like moisture, so it doesn't really love liquid glue, but if you use little bits of it, you can easily get away with it. So we don't want to use a ton of glue on the back of this, otherwise that vellum is going to start to warp and buckle, and we're not going to get a smooth look. So we're adding little bits of glue to the back. Another alternative would be to put some double-sided adhesive on our pieces of cardstock before we do our die cutting and essentially making them into cardstock or die cut stickers. That way we wouldn't need to use the liquid glue. The liquid glue is totally fine. You just need to make sure you're not using too much of it. So when we get to the smaller pieces, I'm using the wax tip tool from my handy tool set. I'm going to be using that for the candle pieces too. It just helps to inlay them a little bit easier because you can just lift up the piece and then move it into place. Again, this is just like putting the pieces of a puzzle together, and you get a really great finished look. I always love using die cuts in this way. Now, another option here, now I use some silver brush cardstock for that menorah. You could also use a specialty cardstock for the candles. like a blue metallic cardstock, or you could even use the silver cardstock and color it blue. Now I'm going to color the back of my vellum with a Copic marker. This is Y15. You can use whatever color yellow you like. This way when we have our pieces together, the candles look like they have a bit of, or the flames look like they have a little bit of a glow to them. So I have my twinkling lights here from Pear Blossom Press. They come with batteries. Now there is a plus sign on the back of the battery, as well as the little housing piece for the battery. You just slide it in and make sure that matches. I always test my battery packs throughout, make sure that the lights are still working. Now these have 3 twinkling lights to them. I'm going to put one in the center of the menorah. That one is always lit. And then I understand that the candles are lit from right to left. So I'm going to be putting the 2 other twinkling lights on the 2 to the right of the menorah. We're working on the back side here, so it's looking like we're working to the left. I'm taping each one of those in place with some Best Ever Craft tape. And before we tape that battery pack in place, I want to put a press here on the bottom right of my card. I'm going to do it with that chipped sapphire distressing, so it's very, very subtle, but I want to give a directive to the person this would be given to make sure that they know what to do with the card. So we have press here. It's a little bit darker than the ink blending on the background, so it does show up, but it's very subtle. It doesn't take anything away from the design. I'm using some 1/4 inch score tape in order to tape that battery pack in place, making sure that that button that triggers those lights is right underneath that stamped press here. Once we have that all stamped in place, I can turn that back over again, and I'm going to secure these wires on the back. I don't want them peeking out of the side of my background here, so I'm just going to use a few more pieces of Best Ever Craft tape in order to do that. And then because we have some dimension to our battery pack, we're going to use some foam tape on my background here in order to make sure that it accommodates that dimension for the battery pack. So this is double thick foam tape. You'll find the one that I used in my in my supply list in my description below. If you don't have one that's this thick, you could always use a double layer of whichever one you have, as long as it ends up being thicker than that little battery pack. We don't want a little bulge where that is on the bottom of the card. So I'm going to put this liberally over the background of my card. I want to make sure that the whole thing is nicely supported. I am putting little pieces, and if there's pieces that are a little bit too big, I just use my scissors to trim them down just a little bit. Now that piece of silver that I die cut the menorah out of is going to be my mat. I made sure to die cut it out of the center, so we get both the die cut as well as the mat out of that same piece. It just extends your cardstock for a bit. I do this all the time, and it's especially helpful with specialty cardstocks because they tend to be just a little bit more pricey than regular cardstock. So once we have the foam tape, or the backing off the foam tape, we can add that to the card. Again, test it just to make sure everything's working. And here we have a beautiful twinkling light Happy Hanukkah card, perfect for giving to those that celebrate Hanukkah. Now, with that outlined silver piece that we die cut, I'm going to create a different card using the Village Companions die set, as well as that Whimsical Skies embossing folder. This is a collection that came out in June, just fun and whimsical. And I just wanted to come up with a bit of a different idea for using this. I always love when seasonal items can be used throughout the year. Now, the menorah itself, I thought it looked a little bit like a rainbow if you turned it upside down. So that's what I'm going to do with it. Now, you don't necessarily have to use this outline piece, because you can see I have to, there's a section that's open for the base of the menorah that you have to kind of fill in with other pieces of the die cut. So there is a little bit of a join there. If you don't like that, you could just use the inner pieces with some scrap colored cardstock to create a rainbow that way and just have them spaced apart. You could use that piece in order to gauge the spacing if you want. So off screen, I die cut the pieces for my rainbow. I have some lilac cardstock, teal topaz, Sicily, dahlia, and beeswax. And I chose just some bright, vibrant colors for this. I'm gluing this all onto some Hammermill cardstock so that I can use that rainbow just as a unit when gluing it to the base of my card. But you could always take the individual pieces and glue them right to the base of your card if you want to. Once we have that together, I'm just going to use my scissors to cut around it. It's a nice, simple shape, easy to cut around. We don't have to worry about it being too complicated. So once we have that, I can put that to the side. I've also used some glitter cardstock from the antique white cardstock pack in order to die cut the clouds from that Village Companions die set. They are just really unique clouds that have some swirlies to the background. Now I'm using the Whimsical Skies embossing folder with some Hammermill cardstock and some of that weathered wood distressing ink to ink that background. Now, after I see my finished design, what I think I would change is just using some light blue cardstock for this background rather than using white cardstock and ink it. I think it ends up looking just slightly busy this way, but I did want to show this technique if you like the way the background turned out so that you could do a background that way, or if you have another way to change it up just a little bit. I figured I'd show that I did this for that background. But again, to give it a little bit more of a clean and simple look, I would just swap out this white cardstock with the ink for some pale blue cardstock. So I'm just doing this background a couple times. You just do this until you have as much ink as you want on that background. I didn't want a ton of contrast between the white cardstock and the ink, so I end up doing it 3 times. You can see that it's not a perfect background when we do the inking of this. Because it's a 3D embossing folder, there's different layers to it or different levels to it. So the ink goes, where it has contact when you're inking that background of the folder. And sometimes it just is a little bit more whimsical, like this particular background is. So I trimmed that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I have a piece of Dahlia cardstock there that I trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches for my mat. I have a scrap of Hammermill cardstock that I'm going to be creating a heat emboss sentiment. This is the Jump for Joy sentiment. I just thought it was a cute sentiment to go with the rainbow and the clouds. I'm going to heat emboss this with silver embossing powder. Now, when you see my finished card, you don't see this sentiment as bold as you could. So you could always do this with some colored embossing powder if you wanted it to be a little bit more bold or vibrant. Another option would be to use some of the cardstock for the rainbow to mat around this. Now, this doesn't have a coordinating die to it, so I'm just going to be using my guillotine trimmer in order to trim that down. I use my clear finger guard there and line up that sentiment along that right edge. Then I flip it over to the other side, do the same thing and make sure that it's nice and even. Then I do the 2 ends to it. And sometimes when I do it, there's one edge that's just a little bit wider and I just redo that, trim a little bit off of it to make sure that it's nice and even. So with our pieces all ready to go, we can start to assemble our card. And this is just on an A2 card base. I put that Dahlia cardstock down first, then our embossed background. Then we can add our sentiment as well as our rainbow and clouds. Now this particular background, I did a Whimsical Skies video back in June. You could easily swap this background for one of the backgrounds that I did there, change this up a little bit. So that's one of the reasons why I shared this on this video, even though I think this particular card would look better with, say, a solid color background. Then we would have, the feature would be more the rainbows. We wouldn't have the distraction from our background. Now for the clouds, I did 3 clouds on one side, 2 on the other side. I'm going to do the smallest cloud on top of a foam dot just so that it has a little bit of extra dimension to it, pops out just a little bit, and we can see a little bit of that dimension. So once we have those foam pot dots on there, the ones that I'm using are really, really thin. So I ended up putting 2 on there just to give it a little bit of extra dimension. We can add that to our cloud cluster there. And there we have an adorable card, just a different way of using that menorah die set. Now you could even use this for a tiny card, for a gift card if you wanted. But again, just a different way of using it to give it some use throughout the year so you don't have a die set that can only be used seasonally. Now this was a top loading A2 card base. It doesn't really matter whether it's top loading or side loading, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of another idea on how to use it. Then we have our Twinkling Light Happy Hanukkah card here. I love interactive cards. I love when you can make things light up and move. And this was just the twinkling lights are so easy to use and an easy way to create some interactive elements in your card. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.